In a world of ice and snow, you're doing your best as an apprentice mechanic, just trying to maintain the cryogenic chambers for the people who chose a deep freeze nap over braving the surface of a post-asteroid planet. But when your master mechanic is kidnapped, your only choice is to strike out on an adventure. Brace yourself, it's going to be a long impact winter. Welcome to the Playdate podcast, bringing you stories from game designers, developers, and the team behind Playdate, the little yellow game console with a crank. I'm Krista Mergen. Today I'm talking with designer and developer Shaun Inman, along with sound designer and composer Matthew Grimm, about Ratcheteer, a wonderful adventure game inspired by Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, and which won Game of the Year in the first annual Playdate Community Awards by Donald Fraser and Andrew Gant, who runs Tiny Yellow Machine. There's a link in the show notes. Slight spoiler alert. We talk about the overall gist of the game, as well as the first 2 ways you can use the crank in the game. But Shaun and Matt try to keep it mostly spoiler-free. Okay, let's say hello.
Hi, my name is Matthew Grimm. I sometimes go by 8-Bit Matt, and I was the composer and sound designer on Ratcheteer.
I'm Shaun Inman. I design and develop games, and I also build web applications like Pulp and Caps.
Pulp is the browser-based game editor for Playdate, where you can create games without even needing to know how to code. And Caps is the online bitmap font creation tool for Playdate. Shaun was the main force behind Ratcheteer.
I did the design and development and the story. It's like a top-down 2D exploration adventure game in the vein of Link's Awakening for the original Game Boy. And story-wise, it's about this sort of steampunk society. An asteroid hits the planet and throws it into an ice age, basically. And there's 2 factions, and one decides like, okay, we're going to use cryogenics and freeze the population and wait until the world thaws out. And there's another group who decides, no, we're going to try to eke out a living on this frozen surface. And there's also a bit of mystery about a third party that may or may not have something to do with this asteroid that hit the planet. And so you are an apprentice mechanic who is tasked with maintaining these cryogenic plants for the people who chose to freeze, wait out the impact winter. And your master is kidnapped by someone or something. And so you go off on an adventure to rescue them, and you end up helping friend and foe alike and saving the world. That was a bit long-winded.
Nah, it was great. So where'd this idea come from?
You know, I was reading through, I kept a journal for the first 2 years of development. And then kids happened. And I was reading through that before this call. And I can't really identify where the ideas came from, at least narratively. They sort of just they sort of trickle in over the course of a couple months. And then, while I'm designing, pixeling or programming, they're sort of gelling in the back of my head and then make connections. And I can't think of any one genesis. But for the game mechanics, a lot of that came out of just exploring crank interaction and seeing, what new ideas were fun and interesting. And then the homage to Link's Awakening was kind of like an anchor point, somewhere I could branch out from, take something familiar and then build on that. And there was actually a point in my notes where I was worrying, was I adding to the conversation or was I just cloning Link's Awakening? And I think that I extended the idea a bit more.
Yeah, I guess maybe the difference between paying homage and directly copying something comes down to really making it your own and saying something new. In everything from video games to literature to filmmaking, you can show your love of other works by reinterpreting and adding to them in your own unique voice. And I think Ratcheteer absolutely does that. It references and kind of rhymes with Zelda games without feeling at all like a rehash or a carbon copy.
Shaun and I both love the Zelda series, and the Ratcheteer is obviously influenced by Link's Awakening, gameplay and music. I really love when that comparison is made too. I think it's an honor to be mentioned in the same sentence as that game. So while writing, I was playing through Link's Awakening on an older Game Boy for inspiration. I was also listening to the soundtrack pretty heavily, and I started development on the Ratcheteer in 2015, and Shaun had started even earlier than that.
Yeah, and I think that probably the idea of the Ratcheteer came out of this idea of having this crank and that's sort of a similar motion to working a ratchet. And then, you've got a ratchet. Well, who uses a ratchet? A mechanic. But then not wanting to just make a mechanic works on cars or something like that. And it grew from there.
And kept growing. For a Playdate game, it's pretty long.
Yeah, it's probably first playthroughs could be up to 6 hours. It's a sizable game.
So Shaun developed most of Ratcheteer while working at Panic, where he also worked on the SDK and tools like Pulp and Caps. So I wanted to hear about his games background and how that all unfolded.
So my background is in graphic design, and I found my way into programming through web development. And so I built a couple of web applications, and then I got back into gaming, playing games, and then realizing that I had like a background in music, I have a background in design. And at that point, I was familiar with programming. So I'm like, those are the three pillars of game design, or game development at least. And so I started doing that, like exploring that. And then me and a couple of friends formed a group called Retro Game Crunch, and we did a Kickstarter, and we built 6 games over the course of a year, and really, I guess, built my chops doing that. And then Panic approached me with the concept of the Playdate and asked if I wanted to make a game. And I was like, yeah. Because around that time, I was struggling with like, okay, am I going to target computers or consoles or touchscreen, like pocket phone devices? And it was just like kind of a mess of options. There were no constraints. It was like you had to account for like all these different input methods. And so they showed me the Playdate with the D-pad and 2 buttons. And I'm like, yeah, constraints. And then I pitched the Ratcheteer, and they thought it was a cool idea. And I started working on that. And then after a month or two, I sort of came on full time and also helped work on the SDK. And and it just sort of snowballed from there. It wasn't hard to come up with new things. It was hard sort of settling on which ones I was going to keep. Let me think. I'm not going to say them, I'm going to count them out.
He literally paused to count them out.
There's at least 5 different behaviors that use the crank. Sorry, 6. I forgot about that one. And they're all kind of used in different ways. There's a little bit of overlap, but with each one, I tried to approach it from a different angle, see what would be interesting. It's really hard to talk about it without talking about it. The first 2 things they're within the first like 10 minutes, so it's probably fine to talk about. But like the first item you find is a lantern, and it's a crank-powered lantern. And so initially you had to crank continuously to keep the meter up, but that got strenuous over the first half of the game. So now it's just whenever you turn it on, it creates a little cone of light around you. But if you crank it all the way up, it throws a wider light cone out in front of you, and that's directional. And then when you get the wrench sword, if you crank, you can do like a spin slash. And so, yeah, I don't know if I want to say much further than that. But there are some secret items. There are some items that don't use the crank, or some tools. So it's not like a one trick sort of thing. It's not completely dependent on the crank. It's interesting because these are items that you use, but they also act as keys. So you can basically create locks. So a hole can be a lock if you don't have the ability to jump. And so for every tool that I came up with a couple of basically locks or walls or things that I could use to let the player encounter the path forward before they have the means of passing through. And I mean, I guess that's fundamental to like Zelda's and Metroid's styles games, but it was kind of a fun puzzle to work out. I did have like all my notes and text documents. And so I had a flow, and I had an atoms text document where you have like your ability, and then you have the different things it can do. And then the way that I laid out my levels was each region has a tiled file, a TMX file.
Yeah, a lot of Playdate designers use Tiled, a 2D game level editor.
And then I have a preprocessor script that will take that giant region-sized file and split it out into individual room files. And it also generate preview images for all that. And so then I have all those in a big PSD or Photoshop document, and I can look around and see what's been done and what's not. And actually, as I was developing it, I created these GIFs. I would take screenshots of my progress as each region was coming together. And then at the end, I would put them all into a Photoshop document and just convert all the layers to frames and export it as an animated GIF. And it's cool to see the world sort of build up, refine itself over time. But as far as planning goes, it was really sort of just organic. You know, an ability would lead to an idea for an environment, which would lead to an idea for a story, which would then sort of roll back around. And then it was just connecting those pieces together. The game was originally written entirely in Lua, and about halfway through, I ported it all to C to get more performance out of it. So that was interesting. I had never really written a pure C game before, so that was interesting. I think I may have talked about this during the Crankin' interview, but I created sort of like a pseudo language called Cross that lets me write something in a style that I'm more comfortable with. I didn't have to manage like headers and source files separately. It was like they got generated from a single source file. And that was sort of designed around more object-oriented ideas than C, which is mostly functional. So that was cool. I got to use that on multiple projects.
Yes, you can hear a little more about why and how he did that in episode 4, which is all about Crankin's time travel adventure, another game where Shaun collaborated with Matthew Grimm.
Yeah, so the sound and music were all done by a frequent collaborator of mine, Matt Grimm. And so he worked with Retro Game Crunch, and he also did the sound for one of my iOS games. And I don't know, he just has a great ear, and he really likes that 8-bit NES aesthetic. And so we got to dabble in Game Boy aesthetic with this one. We have a really easy working relationship. I just float some ideas, and then he comes back and he's got like this great song. And then I give him like a list of sound effects and situations that might require sound effects I haven't thought of that he could think about. And yeah, I mean, he's never disappointed.
Shaun and I initially talked about influences, and that was for the gameplay and the music. It was just to get, an idea for the feel of the game. And I can't remember how far development was at that point, but I know we had something. I feel like we might have even had a small list of songs that we knew we needed too. I know pretty early on in our discussions, we had talked about using recurring themes and melodies that were tied to like a specific character or region. So as I was composing, I just always had that in mind. And then Shaun just kind of let me go for it. I'd compose, and then we'd try it out in the game, like live with it for a while and see if we wanted to keep it around. Luckily, there were not a lot of revisions and only a few songs were cut. And I think that's because we have pretty similar tastes, and we also just had a good understanding of what we were after. My personal favorite song in the game is Recluse. I think it's a beautiful song, and I can't believe that came out of me. I just feel lucky. So development and composing were happening at the same time. I would get billed to the game, and that would allow me to play that specific section and then go write music for it, which I actually really liked because it didn't all have to happen in my head. I got to actually experience it. And sometimes Shaun would send me just short video clips of something. That was usually maybe for sound effects, and we would sometimes export those at slower frame rates so I could actually watch the animation and figure out the timing. Because we actually took the time to fine tune some of the sound effects and get the way that it felt right, which is kind of hard to explain, but it definitely made a difference. I was writing all the music on a MIDI keyboard inside a DAW, and that's a digital audio workstation. And my DAW of choice is Cubase. The MIDI keyboard I was using was an Akai MPK 249, and the majority of sounds that you hear were from a plugin called Chip Sounds by Plogue. And I tried to stay somewhat accurate with Game Boy sounds, but I didn't stick to exactly what hardware could do. I embellished a little bit, but it's still pretty close to Game Boy-ish, I guess. Composing music and designing sound effects were happening at the same time. Not literally the same time, but I was working on them at the same time. But with sound effects, I kind of took a different approach. So all the sound effects were actually written in code, and it was using a language called MML, which is Music Macro Language. And that's just a simple programming language that controls the sound channels of an NES. So for me, I was just faster and more comfortable with that, to get the sounds out of it that I wanted rather than sitting in a DAW with a keyboard and trying to figure it out. Shaun had created this massive list of sound effects that we needed, and I would fill in the gaps as things came up. But sound effects were happening all the way throughout development, from day one all the way until I was actually done. The sound effects was probably the last thing I worked on. I think we ended up with around 170 total sound effects in the game.
For the Ratcheteer, I made a sound test app that I'm trying to remember how that one worked. It was so long ago. It may have been just a Lua file that he could compile and run. Yeah, there was a JSON file where he could edit the properties of for a song, he could set a loop point where after this point it loops when it reaches the end back to that point. When you could individually set the volume and everything so you get the levels all right.
Forgive me because my memory is a little fuzzy on this one. It's been about 5 years since I've last thought about it. When we started development, that includes music and sound design too, there was no SDK, build tools, or core framework fully in place. I believe Shaun was working on that stuff at the same time, so I had no easy way to test sounds in the game. And I know builds were slow, and I just needed a quicker feedback loop. So I don't know what wizardry Shaun cooked up, but if I remember correctly, I was able to just put wave files into a specific folder, and somehow they would get loaded into memory and we wouldn't have to rebuild at all. I think if anything, we might have had to like reboot the simulator or something. Maybe not even that, like they might have just shown up. I really can't remember, but that obviously allowed me to iterate much faster. So I could try out a sound effect in the game. If it didn't work, like go work on it, import a new one, and like nothing really slowed down the workflow. So that was really great.
I don't think we had anything like that for Crankin, because that was such a complicated sound engine.
Yeah, the process of slowing down, speeding up, and reversing the audio in Crankin's time travel adventure would have made that extra difficult. But again, you can hear more about that game's development process and why the sound in particular was so challenging in episode 4.
I guess while we're still talking about Link's Awakening, let's talk about one of the original composers, and that's Kazumi Totaka. So if you're into Nintendo games, I guarantee you've heard other music that he's composed. Think like Wii channel music or like basically every Animal Crossing game. But 2 games, I guess in particular, that I was listening to during this time when I was writing because I just wanted some good inspiration. The first one was Wave Race 64. I just love every track on that. And then Super Mario Land 2, 6 Golden Coins. That's like one of my all-time favorite Game Boy games. I think it's a masterpiece, everything about it. For other inspirations, I guess we can just go through a short list of my video game composer heroes and the stuff they made that I was listening to at the time. I didn't really pull inspiration from much outside of video games, at least not intentionally. So first is Hirokazu Tanaka. Also known as Hip Tanaka or Chip Tanaka, and he is my favorite of all time. And that's not just in video game music, like music period. He's the best, he's my favorite. So he's best known for stuff like Metroid, Kid Icarus, Dr. Mario, like early Nintendo stuff. But the game I pulled the most inspiration from, I think anyway, is Mother. So that was Japan only, or at least we didn't get it in North America for a long time. You probably know it as Earthbound Beginnings if you played it recently. I just think that everything about that soundtrack is amazing. The game is also great too. Other games of his that I was listening to at the time was Balloon Fight. I just love how quirky that game is, the sound too. And then Super Mario Land, which is also like an all-time great Game Boy game. Next on my list is Jake Kaufman, also known as Vert. And just like Hip Tanaka, I basically love everything he's ever released. It's all mind-blowing, amazing. Just go find anything he's made. So the game that I pulled the most inspiration from, and that was still new at the time, was Shovel Knight. I think it had been out for about a year at that point when I started working on the Ratcheteer. So I have like really fond memories of like mowing the yard that summer with my earbuds in, like rocking out to the Shovel Knight album. And the last composer on my list is Masashi Kageyama. He was the composer of the game Gimmick. You might have heard of it, but maybe not. It flew under the radar for a long time, and now it has like a cult following, at least in chip music. It's definitely a masterpiece, the game and the music. So if you've never heard that soundtrack, like go listen to it right now. It'll change your life. I was listening to a lot of video game music while I was composing. Most of it was from the NES and Game Boy era. But I guess there's at least 2 other things I wanted to point out that I was listening to a lot. Pretty much all of the Pokemon Game Boy games. Those all have amazing soundtracks. And then the other one, which is kind of obscure, it's a fishing game on the NES called the Blue Marlin. And it absolutely has like no business having such good music for a fishing game. Go check it out.
Another thing we haven't touched on is another past collaborator that I've worked with before. Charlie Davis did the illustrations for the game. And so that was really fun. He did the graphics that are shown during the ending and the title screen graphic. So I did all the sprite work. And so his illustrations were based on those. So I sent him a little story synopsis and then kind of like a family tree graphic of like how all the different characters related. And so they could see like all their different like physical characteristics. I would just do like my basically like pencil version of programmer art for like these ideas that I had for scenes for the end credits and for the title screen. I'd send them off to him and he would just come back with this great art in his style. I love the style. It's like a simple, almost like early, is it HAL Laboratories? Like the Kirby devs, just simple flat shapes. I think it's a good pairing with the pixel art because they're kind of reduced in their complexity. In order to get the proportions on screen that I wanted, I had to go with a kind of odd pixel size. So a lot of times when you're dealing with pixel art games like this, you're thinking in units of like 8 or 16 pixel squares. And it settled on 12 to get like the right scale that I wanted. And so like 8 can be a little constrictive. 16 sometimes can feel like a bit too much because like I'm not really an illustrator. And so a lot of my pixel art design is more kind of thinking architecturally, I don't know how to describe it. And so that it was kind of an extra tight constraint that was fun to work within and figure out the limitations of and how best to communicate with such tight constraints. That, of course, is all on top of the black and white.
And this was all before Shaun had created the caps tool for drawing bitmap fonts on Playdate. So creating the text in the game was extra laborious.
It came well before caps, like 5 years before maybe. So all the type was designed in Photoshop. And then I used a tool called fontstruct.com to turn it into a true type font, which I could then bring back into Photoshop and lay out the HUD and work on my window Chrome and stuff like that. Originally, there was a font tool for the SDK that was just Mac specific. And as we were opening up the beta to more developers, we realized we're going to need something that's more cross-platform. And I'm trying to think, I think we started Pulp before Caps. And so I had a lot of the rendering logic worked out using the HTML canvas. And so that got up and running pretty quickly. And a lot of the design was informed by the original Playdate font tool, coupled with my own past experience designing pixel type and stuff like that. I think the Zelda-like is well tuned to continuing to pull the person in because you're constantly unlocking new things and being reminded of past areas you couldn't get to previously. But then as far as balancing for difficulty and stuff, it's funny, as a dev, you're working on your game so much and you're playtesting it yourself so much that like you don't even realize that you basically just have a mastery over every system. You understand how everything works intimately, like behind the scenes. And so a lot of times you'll find that you've tuned it way too hard. And so playtesting helps a lot with that. So I have a couple of close friends who have played it. And then we did QA with Plastic Fern. And that helps sort of get that balance right. And hopefully on top of all like the game systems and the mechanics, the narrative as well is sort of keeping people interested and trickling down little bits of information and fleshing out the story as you go.
Yeah, I think the game feels pretty well balanced in terms of challenge, but there is a spoiler-free hint guide that Shaun put together. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, just in case. So what does Shaun think about creating more games for Playdate in the future?
I've got a bunch of prototypes in varying states of completeness. But yeah, I'd definitely love to make more.
And actually, in the time since we recorded this conversation, his game Word Trip launched with Catalog, our on-device game store. Word Trip is a light-action word-building game with 3 levels of difficulty, daily challenges, and a stress-free free play mode. It includes online leaderboards, and it's a lot more challenging than it might seem at first. So definitely check that out if you're into word games. But what are Shaun and Matthew's hopes for people when they turn on their Playdate to play Ratcheteer?
I hope that they enjoy exploring the world and learning about what's happened to the people and why they're acting the way they are. And I hope that they find the third group interesting. I hope that they just have fun learning the game and finding all the secrets that I've put in there.
To explore, find some secrets, just fully experience it and see it through to the end. I know Shaun poured his heart and soul into this game, and I feel the same way about the music and the sound. And as the composer, I hope I wrote some melodies that are catchy and stick with you long after you've played the game.
Yeah, from the NES and Game Boy musical inspirations to the overall homage to Link's Awakening, I definitely hope you enjoy exploring this frozen world and uncovering its mysteries in Ratcheteer. There are a ton of links in the show notes where you can learn more about Shaun Inman, Matthew Grimm, Charlie Davis, and a bunch of the tools, games, and composers they referenced in this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and stay tuned for more episodes coming soon to the Playdate podcast feed. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye. It was good talking to you.
The Playdate podcast was written, produced, and edited by me, Krista Mergen. Cable Sasser and Simon Panrucker composed the theme song. Additional music and sound effects were composed by Matthew Grimm and come from Ratcheteer. Plus, this episode includes music from the games and composers he referenced, including Kazumi Totaka, Hip Tanaka, Jake Kaufman, and Masashi Kagayama. Huge thanks to Tim Coulter and Asher Cabrera for wrangling the podcast feed and working on the website, James Moore for making me an awesome Playdate audio extraction app, and Nevin Mergen, who created the podcast artwork and site design. And thanks as always to everyone at Panic. Playdate is shipping now and available for pre-order at play.date.
So we'd been into it for a few years and were like super surprised when Nintendo announced the remake of Link's Awakening. That was in 2019 on the Nintendo Switch. We obviously were like super happy to see that revive, so we played through it immediately.